Pull her from the rotation. She's a liability. The words carried across the observation deck without any effort at discretion. Commander Aldrich Vane said them the way a man says something he has already decided is obvious, flat, final, and loud enough for the 6 people nearby to hear. Staff Sergeant Neva Solis stood 40 yards below on the rifle range, completely still, her cheek resting against the stock of a weapon she had been shooting since she was 19 years old. She heard every word. She always heard the words. You develop that particular sensitivity when you grow up the youngest of 4 siblings in a house, where the important conversations happen just outside the door you were supposed to be sleeping behind. She didn't move. She breathed in, she breathed out, she squeezed. The round hit the target at 1,200 meters with the kind of precision that makes range officers stop writing on their clipboards. She had been at Fort Drayton for 4 days. The transport had come in at 0445 on a Tuesday morning in late October, rolling through the Nevada desert in the particular darkness that belongs to places far enough from any city that the sky actually shows its full inventory of stars. Neva had watched them through the rear window of the vehicle without thinking about them specifically, the way you watch something familiar while your mind is doing other work. She was thinking about the briefing she'd received 3 days earlier. Temporary reassignment, advanced range evaluation, experimental long-distance fire coordination program. 12 weeks. Language had been careful and official and had told her almost nothing about what she was actually walking into. She was 31 years old, Staff Sergeant, United States Army. 2 deployments to places the public knew by region rather than by name. A marksmanship record that her commanding officer at her last posting had described, in writing, as statistically improbable. She had a way with numbers, with trajectories and wind calculations, and the specific mathematics of putting a round exactly where it needed to go across distances that most people in her position would consider outside the practical range of certainty. She did not consider anything outside the range of certainty. She considered everything a problem, with a solution that either you had found or you hadn't yet. None of that was visible from the outside. What was visible from the outside was a woman of 31 with a quiet face and a bag that was lighter than most people packed for a weekend, stepping down from a transport vehicle at a classified range facility while men who had been there for months watched with expressions they didn't bother to conceal. The first person who spoke to her that morning was a sergeant named Doyle, Callum Doyle, broad-shouldered, 34, with the particular ease of a man who has been the most capable person in every room he has entered for long enough that it has become part of his operating assumption. He introduced himself with the practiced friendliness of someone who understood social management and was deploying it consciously. "Welcome to Drayton," he said. "Fair warning, the coffee in the East Building is genuinely terrible. West Building has a working machine." "Good to know," she said. He walked beside her toward the administration building, and she noticed the way the other men, near the vehicle bay, registered his choice to approach her. The specific social mathematics of someone senior making contact, it set a tone, but the tone Doyle was setting was the kind that established itself as patronizing before it had spoken a full sentence. She filed it. She filed everything. Commander Aldrich Vane ran the program. She understood that within the first hour, not from any formal introduction, but from the way the air changed when he crossed the yard. 48 years old, 22 years of service, a voice that operated at the volume of someone accustomed to being the one who set the volume for the room. He had developed this program over 7 years, a fire coordination method that integrated long-range marksmanship with real-time atmospheric calculation in ways that the traditional training apparatus hadn't caught up to. He believed in it the way people believe in things they have built themselves. Absolutely. And with a particular sensitivity to any evidence that might require revision. At the first morning briefing, he introduced the personnel present by name and specialty. He went through 11 people. He did not say Neva's name. He moved from the man on her left to the topic of the week's schedule without a pause, as though the space she occupied had not registered as requiring acknowledgement. She noted it. She did not react to it. The program ran 12 specialists through a rotating series of increasingly complex fire scenarios: wind, elevation, moving targets at distances ranging from 800 to 1,400 meters, coordination between spotters and shooters across degraded communication conditions. The point was not simply accuracy. Any qualified shooter could be accurate under controlled conditions. The point was accuracy under the specific variables that made accuracy difficult: fatigue, noise, incomplete information, and the psychological pressure of being evaluated while performing. Neva performed without difficulty in the first 3 days. She didn't perform spectacularly, not because she couldn't, but because she had learned a long time ago that spectacle in a new environment was a social act, and social acts in unfamiliar territory required more information than she currently had. She performed accurately, consistently, and without drawing unnecessary attention, and she used the time to gather the information she needed. By day 3, she had a clear picture. Vane had designed the program around a specific philosophy: high-pressure selection. The idea that the most useful thing a training environment could do was separate those who performed under maximum stress from those who didn't. This was not an unusual philosophy. What was unusual was the way he implemented it. The pressure was not distributed evenly. Certain participants, the ones Vane had already decided through some prior calculation were the right candidates, received the complex scenarios, the additional resources, the benefit of structured feedback. Others received a different version of the program: harder conditions, less information, evaluative parameters that were not clearly communicated in advance. The architecture of the process was designed to produce outcomes it claimed to be measuring. She had seen versions of this before, never this organized. On day 4, Commander Vane stood on the observation deck while Neva was running her second solo qualification scenario. The scenario required 6 sequential shots at targets between 900 and 1,350 meters, under a 14-knot crosswind, with a 180-foot elevation change between the firing position and the farthest target. It was, by any objective measurement, a difficult scenario. She had run the calculations before she picked up the weapon, in her head, which was where she ran all her calculations, because she had been doing this long enough that the math operated somewhat below the level of conscious effort, the way driving a familiar road operates for someone who has driven it 1,000 times. She hit all 6 targets. Vane, on the deck above, said, "Pull her from the rotation. She's a liability." The range officer, a young specialist named Adela Grant, stood beside him holding a clipboard and said nothing. Her pencil had stopped moving. She was looking at her own notation of Neva's hits: 6 for 6, times recorded, distances confirmed. And she was doing the thing people do when they are trying to reconcile 2 things that cannot simultaneously be true. That evening, Vane released a revised scenario schedule. Neva's name appeared in a different column from the other 11 participants. She was assigned to a separate qualification track: individual assessment, no team coordination scenarios, no access to the atmospheric data terminals that the rest of the program used as standard equipment. The justification listed in the schedule was a single phrase: supplemental evaluation required. She read the schedule twice. Then she read it a third time, not because she was confused, but because she had learned that the third reading sometimes shows you the thing the first 2 don't. The thing the third reading showed her: the supplemental evaluation track had no defined completion criteria, no benchmarks, no metrics, no specified end condition. It was a track designed to continue for as long as Vane decided it should continue, which meant it was not a track at all. It was a waiting room with the word evaluation written on the door. She went to dinner. She ate protein and carbohydrates and drank water, and she sat at the end of the table where she could see the full room, and she watched. What she watched was a program whose social structure had been built in the image of one man's certainties. Men who were in Vane's favor performed their favor loudly, agreeing with his assessments in group settings, positioning themselves near him during break periods, laughing at the right moments. Men who were not in his favor had developed the particular skill of becoming invisible when he was in the room. And Adela Grant, the range specialist with the clipboard, sat 2 seats to the right of nobody important and watched the room with the careful eyes of someone who had been watching for longer than she had been acting. Neva made a mental note to learn more about Grant. 3 days later, Doyle found her at the West Building coffee machine at ZO620. Not by accident. She had clocked enough of his movement patterns to know that 0620 West Building was not his routine. He had come to find her specifically, which meant he had something to say that he hadn't been able to say in a group setting, which meant it was either an attempt to manage her or an attempt to warn her. "How's the supplemental track going?" he asked. "I'm completing the assigned scenarios," she said. He poured coffee and was quiet for a moment in the deliberate way of someone composing what comes next. "Vane ran the supplemental track once before," he said. "About 8 months ago. Specialist named Pren. Good shooter, strong numbers." He looked into his cup. "Pren didn't finish the 12 weeks. What happened to Pren?" "Administrative medical separation. Hand injury during a live scenario." He paused. "The injury report said equipment malfunction." She looked at him steadily. "Was it?" Doyle was quiet for a moment. "I wasn't there," he said. "I heard about it afterward, and I've thought about it a lot since then." He met her eyes for the first time since he'd started talking. "I'm not telling you this because I know what to do about it. I'm telling you because I've been here 16 months, and I'm tired of knowing things I'm not doing anything with." He left before she could respond. She stood at the coffee machine for a moment after he was gone, turning over what he'd said. Not the surface content. She had already understood that kind of thing was possible from day one. What she was turning over was the subtext. A man who had known for 8 months and done nothing was now, apparently, reconsidering. Something had changed his calculation. She didn't know yet what it was. She went back to her bunk and opened her personal notebook. Not the official one, her own. Small, waterproof cover, the kind she'd been carrying since her first deployment because she had learned early that the most important record is the one you keep yourself. She had been writing in it since day one. The scenario Vane ran on day 9 was the one everyone at Fort Drayton would remember, though they would describe it differently depending on how honest they were willing to be with themselves about what they had seen. He called it an advanced coordination exercise. Every participant in the program assembled at the main range at 0700. The setup was elaborate. A multi-stage sequential scenario requiring 2-person spotting and shooting teams, real-time communication, atmospheric adjustment mid-scenario, and a final individual component in which each shooter would take 3 shots at maximum range, 1,400 meters, under timed conditions. Neva was not assigned a team partner. She was assigned to the individual component only, which Vane announced in front of the full group without comment, as though the asymmetry was self-explanatory. Several people looked at her. Most of them looked away. The team components ran first. She watched from the observation area and noted the things worth noting. Doyle's team performed well, efficiently, with the kind of wordless coordination that develops between people who have trained together long enough to stop announcing their decisions. 2 other teams had communication problems that were more than technical. They were relational, the kind that happen when people have been performing cooperation for an evaluator without actually developing it. Then the individual component. 11 shooters, maximum range, 3 shots each, timed. She went 12th. That was Vane's choice, not the schedule's. He announced the order himself. The first 11 completed their rounds. The targets were scored by the range staff. She didn't watch the numbers, she watched the faces. Doyle hit 2 of 3. The others ranged from 1 to 2. Maximum range under full-time pressure with a wind that had shifted twice since morning was producing exactly the results maximum range under those conditions produced. Inconsistency. Vane announced her turn with the particular flatness of a man who has already decided what the result will be and is waiting for the event to confirm it. She settled into position. The wind was coming from the northwest at 11 knots, with a gust pattern she had been tracking for 20 minutes. The target at 1,400 meters was a standard silhouette. Elevation differential from her position, 210 feet. She had already run the full calculation. She had run it 3 times, in fact, starting 40 minutes earlier, because she ran calculations the way other people stretch before a race. The timer started. She fired. Reload. Fired. Reload. Fired. The range officer confirmed, 3 for 3. The observation deck went quiet. Not the polite quiet of an audience being respectful, the specific quiet of people who have just watched something that requires them to revise an assumption they didn't realize they were holding. Vane's face, when she looked up at him, was doing something she recognized from the fourth day, the same thing it had done when he saw her 6-for-6 hit record. Something that was not calculation, not strategy, not professional assessment. It was the face of a man who has structured his world around a conclusion and is watching the conclusion become untenable. He said from the deck, "Interesting result. We'll see if it holds up under extended conditions." Extended conditions, undefined timeline, no completion criteria. She nodded once and began disassembling her weapon for cleaning. That evening, Adela Grant knocked on the door of the supply room where Neva had arranged her equipment for the next morning. Grant came in without being asked, which told Neva something. People who wait to be asked are managing the interaction. People who walk in have already decided. "I've been here 14 months, Grant said. She stood near the door and didn't try to make herself comfortable in the space, which also told Neva something. This was not a social visit. "I've been writing range assessment records for 14 months. Every shot, every wind reading, every time, and my records go into the official log, and then there's a separate summary that Vane submits to oversight. And the two documents are not always consistent." Neva looked at her. "How long have you known that?" "Long enough," Grant said. She looked at the floor for a moment. "I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, that I was too junior, that nobody would take my word over his." She paused. "Today I watched you hit 3 targets at full 400 meters under a shifting crosswind with no spotting support. And then I watched him say interesting result and walk away, and something in me just..." She stopped. Started again. "I'm tired of writing records that disappear. Your records are the only ones with my actual numbers in them?" Neva said. "Yes." Grant met her eyes. "I make a copy, personal drive, encrypted, 14 months of copies." The room was quiet. Outside, the Nevada desert was doing its nighttime thing. Wind against the building walls, the distant sound of a generator, the specific silence of a place that is far from anything else. "I need to know something," Neva said. "Pren, the specialist from 8 months ago. The hand injury." Grant's expression changed. Not dramatically, a millimeter of something. "I was there," she said. "The equipment didn't malfunction. The room went very still. Was it documented?" "The official report said malfunction." Grant's jaw was tight. "I wrote a supplemental note in my personal log. I didn't know what else to do with it. I was 7 months into my first posting." She paused. "Pren asked me once before he left if I'd put anything in writing. I said yes. He said..." She stopped. "He said keep it. He said maybe it would matter later." Neva looked at her for a long moment. "I need you to tell me what you have," she said. "All of it. And I need you to be sure, because once we start, we don't stop." Grant breathed in, breathed out. "I'm sure," she said. "I've been sure for 8 months. I just needed someone to start." What happened in the next 48 hours had the quality that institutional change always has in its early stages. It looked like nothing from the outside, and it was everything from the inside. Neva began with the notebook, not the personal record she'd been keeping since day one, though that would matter, but a second document, structured and sequential, built from Grant's 14 months of range assessment copies, cross-referenced with the official logs that Grant had access to through her administrative function. The discrepancies were not subtle. Numbers had been adjusted. Scenario evaluations had been modified between the range floor record and the oversight summary. Candidates who had performed above threshold had been documented below it. Candidates Vane favored had the inverse. The Pren entry in Grant's personal log was 11 lines of clear, dated, witnessed notation. Doyle found them in the supply room at 2200 and stood in the doorway looking at the spread of documents on the table with the expression of a man arriving at a destination he had been circling for 8 months. "What do you need from me?" he said. "Everything you know," Neva said. Written, dated, signed. He sat down and pulled a pen from his pocket, and for the next hour and 20 minutes he wrote. He wrote about Pren. He wrote about 3 other candidates in the prior year whose outcomes he had found implausible given what he had observed of their performance. He wrote about 2 conversations with Vane in which Vane had said things about the program's selection philosophy that Doyle had told himself at the time were expressions of professional opinion. Reread in the context of what was on this table, they were something else. When he finished, he looked at the pages and said, "I should have done this 8 months ago." "You're doing it now," Neva said. "That's not the same thing." "No," she agreed. "But it's what's available." The third person to knock on the supply room door that night was someone she hadn't expected. Specialist Kieran Moss was 24 years old and had been at Fort Drayton for 5 months. He'd been in Vane's favor column since the beginning. Good shooter, socially fluent, the kind of candidate the program had been designed to produce. He knocked at 23:30 and stood in the doorway, looking younger than he had in every group setting she'd observed him in. "I heard about the Pren situation," he said. "Not the official version, the actual one." He paused. "A friend of mine at Pendleton knows Pren. They've stayed in contact." He looked at the table. "Pren wants to talk. He's wanted to talk for 8 months. He didn't know if there was anyone to talk to." The room was quiet. "There's someone to talk to," Neva said. Moss pulled out his phone. The oversight request went through the Judge Advocate General's office at Fort Bragg, submitted through Grant's JAG contact, a captain she'd met at a training crossover 8 months earlier and maintained professional communication with, not because she'd been planning anything, but because she had learned early in her career that the people you trust in an institution are worth keeping track of. The captain asked 4 questions. The last one was, "Is there documentary evidence independent of the subject's testimony?" 14 months of range assessment records with timestamps, Grant said. Direct contradiction with official oversight submissions, and a personal log entry from a prior candidate contemporaneous dated. A pause. "Don't transmit that documentation through base channels. Use the secure link I'm about to send you. I'm making a call." Vane noticed something had shifted at 0900 the following morning, though he couldn't have said precisely what. The way a man who has been the weather for a long time notices when the atmosphere is doing something he didn't authorize. He moved through the morning briefing with his standard precision, but there was something underneath the precision. A frequency of checking. Eye contact held slightly too long in some places, avoided in others. At 1100, he called Neva to his office. She came. He was behind his desk with the particular posture of a man who has arranged his furniture to communicate authority. She sat in the chair across from him, which was lower than his, which was also a communication. She noted it without reacting to it. "Your numbers are strong," he said. "Thank you, Commander. I want to understand something about your approach." He leaned forward slightly. "The calculation work. Your spotter reports show no external data consultation. You're running atmospheric math in your head under field conditions." "That's correct." He studied her. "Where did you develop that?" "Practice," she said. "It started as a training habit. It became structural." He was quiet for a moment. Something was moving behind his eyes that she recognized, the same thing she'd seen on day 4, on day 9. A man trying to decide whether what he was looking at was a problem or a resource. He had been trying to make that determination since she arrived, and the fact that he still couldn't resolve it was what kept producing the behavior she'd been documenting. "I'm thinking about restructuring the supplemental track," he said, "making the parameters clearer." "I appreciate that, Commander." He looked at her for a long moment. "You're not what I expected," he said. She held his gaze. "I rarely am," she said. "It usually takes people a few days to adjust their evaluation." Something crossed his face that she couldn't fully categorize. Then it closed down. "That'll be all," he said. She stood and left. She did not look back. At 1400, the oversight inquiry notification arrived at Fort Drayton's administrative office. It was addressed to the interim base commander, a designation that did not yet exist because Vane was still the acting program director. The notification therefore landed with the base's senior administrative officer, a major named Sylvia Trent, who read it twice and then made a phone call. Vane was in his office when Trent knocked. She told him what the notification contained: a formal inquiry initiated by the JAG office at Bragg, requesting preservation of all range assessment records, oversight summaries, and administrative documentation for the Fort Drayton Advanced Fire Coordination Program, retroactive to the program's inception, pending review. He was directed to cease any modification or supplementation of existing records, pending the inquiry's completion. She said this in the flat language of someone reading from a document they have had enough time to be certain they understand, and when she was finished, she looked at him with the expression of a senior administrator who has just done the thing her position required her to do, and is now waiting to see what happens next. Vane said, "Who initiated this?" Trent said, "The inquiry documentation lists multiple sources. The specific identities of reporting parties are protected under JAG procedure." Vane was quiet. "I'll need your record access credentials suspended pending the review," Trent said. "Standard protocol." She held out a form. He took it. He signed it. And Neva, who was in the adjacent corridor at that moment, for reasons that had nothing to do with surveillance, and everything to do with the fact that the administrative building had the only printer she'd had access to all week, heard the quality of the silence that followed. It was the silence of a program whose architect had just been removed from the controls. Moss found her on the range that afternoon, running the only kind of scenario she could currently run without official program resources, her own. She had set up a personal qualification series at the 1,000-meter line with her own equipment, her own data, her own time. "Pren submitted his statement this morning," Moss said, "through the JAG link. 11 pages. She kept her eyes on the target. How is he?" Moss was quiet for a moment. He said he'd been carrying it alone for 8 months. He said the hardest part wasn't what Vane did. The hardest part was having no record that it happened. He paused. He said when I called him, the first thing he asked was whether anyone had been keeping documentation. She breathed out slowly. "What did you tell him?" "I told him yes. I told him there were 14 months of independent records and a personal log with his incident in it and a staff sergeant who had been writing in a notebook since day one." Moss was quiet. "He cried," he said. "He didn't say anything for about 30 seconds. And then he said, 'Good.'" She fired. The round hit the center of the target. She set the weapon down and looked at the distance between where she was standing and where the target was, which was the same distance it had always been, and thought about Pren in whatever room he was in when Moss called him, carrying 8 months of a story that had nowhere to go, and what it meant to him to find out there was somewhere for it to go now. Vane requested a formal meeting with the JAG investigators when they arrived from Bragg 2 days later. He requested it voluntarily without counsel, which told Neva, when Doyle informed her, that he believed he could still talk his way through it. It was not an irrational belief. He had been doing exactly that for 22 years. He was skilled at it. He knew how to frame narrative, how to establish context, how to make the examiner feel they were missing something he could supply. What he didn't know was what was in 14 months of Grant's records. The lead investigator was a major named Gail Ostrander, 51, with the particular economy of movement of someone who has been doing this long enough to have stopped performing any version of it. She worked through the documentation systematically, starting with Grant's range records and the official oversight submissions, cross-referencing line by line with a thoroughness that took 11 hours over 2 days. On the third morning, Ostrander asked Neva to come in. Neva sat across from her and did not wait to be prompted. "Before anything else," she said, "I want to show you something." She placed the notebook on the table between them. Ostrander looked at it. "What is this?" "Personal documentation, day 1 through present." She opened it to the first page. Every interaction with Commander Vane that contained evaluative language, every scenario assignment I was given, and the assignment given to comparable personnel, every discrepancy I observed between my objective performance and Vane's verbal assessment of it. Dated entries, some with times. Ostrander picked up the notebook and read in silence for 4 minutes. When she looked up, her expression had not changed, but something behind it had settled. "You started this on day 1, she said. "Before you knew what you were walking into, I started every posting," Neva said. "I've been keeping a personal field record since my first deployment. It's not a strategy, it's how I process environments." Ostrander looked at her for a moment. Then she looked back at the notebook. "Walk me through it," she said. "Start from the transport." Neva talked for 90 minutes. She was precise about what she had observed directly and careful about distinguishing observation from inference. She had given statements before, after deployments, After incidents, after the particular kind of professional moments that require documentation, and she knew that the value of a statement was in its specificity and in its honesty about its own limits. When she finished, Ostrander closed her own notebook and said, "The documentation you've provided, combined with specialist grants records and the prior candidate's statement, constitutes the most complete evidentiary package I've received in an institutional review in approximately 9 years." She paused, not because of the volume, because of the independence. 3 separate people, keeping separate records for separate reasons that tell the same story. She looked at Neva directly. "This process will take time. Vane will have representation. He will argue methodology, philosophy, authority. This will not be a fast resolution." "I know," Neva said. "Are you prepared for that?" "I've been patient before," she said. "It's a skill." Something moved through Ostrander's expression, not quite a smile, but in its vicinity. "Go rest," she said. "We have a great deal of work ahead." Vane's suspension came within 24 hours of the investigators completing their preliminary review. Major Trent delivered the formal notification to his office at 1700. Doyle heard about it from the administrative assistant before the hour was out and found Neva in the West Building, which was where she was because she had been there every morning at 0620, and it had become, without ceremony, the place where the people she trusted knew to find her. "It's done," he said. "Interim program director is coming from the regional office tomorrow morning. Vane is confined to base housing. Access cards deactivated." She held the coffee cup between her hands. "How did he receive it?" Doyle thought about this. Trent said he listened to the whole notification without interrupting. When they finished, he asked one question. "What question?" He asked which candidate initiated the complaint. She was quiet for a moment. What did they tell him? That the inquiry had multiple sources and the identities of reporting parties were protected. Doyle looked at his own cup. He didn't say anything after that. He just sat there. He paused. Finch was in the building. Said it was the first time in 16 months he'd seen Vane sit somewhere without it looking like a choice he'd made. She thought about that, about what it costs a man to have the architecture of 22 years suspended in an afternoon. Not with sympathy, with the honest weight of a thing that has been a long time arriving. "Pren," she said. "Someone should tell him." "Moss already called him," Doyle said. "An hour ago, and?" Doyle looked at her with the expression of a man who is finding it difficult to choose between several true things and is deciding which one to say first. Moss said he was quiet for about 10 seconds, and then he said he needed to sit down. He paused. He said it's the first time in 8 months something that was real also had a record. The thing that was real had a record. She thought about that long after Doyle left. She thought about Pren in whatever room he was in, and about the 8 months between his posting and hers, and what might have been different if anyone had started writing earlier. She did not think about this with anger. Anger at the past was fuel spent on something that couldn't use it. She thought about it with the particular precision of someone who understands that the distance between Pren's story and her own was not a matter of her being stronger or more prepared. It was a matter of documentation existing this time. 3 separate people, keeping separate records for separate reasons. That was what had changed the math. 3 weeks later, Ostrander's team delivered preliminary findings to Army Command. Formal charges against Vane covering falsification of program records, abuse of command authority, and deliberate manipulation of evaluation outcomes. A secondary inquiry had been opened into the oversight channel through which Vane's modified summaries had been received without escalation for 3 years, which meant the investigation was going to get larger before it resolved, and the resolution was going to require more than one officer's accountability. Neva was no longer at Fort Drayton when the findings were released. She had been cleared for reassignment by the interim program director 10 days after the suspension, with a formal note in her file describing her performance in the Advanced Fire Coordination Program as, in the director's own language, the most precise long-range work the evaluation staff had recorded in 3 years of the program's operation. She read that notation once, sitting in a vehicle heading back toward the highway. Then she put it away. What stayed with her was not the notation. It was a call she'd received 2 days before her departure from a number she didn't recognize. She had almost not answered it. It was Pren. He had gotten her contact from Moss with her permission, and he called to say one thing, which he said in about 90 seconds, and then ended the call before she could respond. He said, "For 8 months I couldn't explain what happened to me in a way that anyone would take seriously, because the only record was the official one, and the official one was wrong. And then there was another record, and the other record was right, and suddenly what happened to me was real in a way it hadn't been before." He paused. "I don't know who you are, not really, but I know that you started writing on day 1, and I know what that meant for me, and I wanted to say thank you." She held the phone for a moment after the call ended, in the desert outside Fort Drayton, with the Nevada wind doing its indifferent work across the scrub in the distance. Then she opened the notebook. She turned to a clean page. She wrote the date and the time the way she always did, and she wrote, "Pren called." And then she wrote one more line. The things she had been thinking about since the day Doyle told her about him. Since the day Grant said, "Keep it, maybe it will matter later." Since the first morning on the transport truck when she had understood, with the calm certainty she brought to every calculation, that the record she kept for herself was the only one she could be sure of. She wrote, "Documentation is not a strategy. It is a refusal." Then she closed the notebook and looked out at the desert, which was doing what deserts do, holding everything and revealing nothing, and thought about the work that was still ahead. The inquiry that would expand before it contracted. The officers whose names were now in files they didn't know existed. The policy revisions that would eventually move through training programs she would never visit, affecting candidates whose names she would never know. She had not done any of it to be known. She had done it because she had walked into a system designed to make her outcome feel inevitable, and she had understood on the first morning with the same precision she brought to wind calculations and trajectory problems, that the only thing that makes an unjust outcome inevitable is the absence of a record that says otherwise. The vehicle moved out onto the highway. The desert fell away behind her. Somewhere in a room in Bragg, Ostrander was still working. Somewhere in a house in California, Pren was putting down something he had been carrying for 8 months. And in the notebook in her bag, dated and timed and written in the careful hand of someone who had understood since Fallujah and confirmed again in Nevada that the world does not change because of the strongest person in the room. It changes because enough people decide to write it down.